Well, Mark Bou Mansour's communications coordinator of the Tax Justice Network. They deny wrongdoing, is what I'll start by saying to you, sir. But just because it's not illegal doesn't make it right, does it?
You're absolutely right, and it's not necessarily illegal. It kind of falls in a gray area, and this tends to be a big misconception. A lot of these tax abuse schemes, it's not really clear if they're legal until they've put to the test of court. They basically interpret existing tax laws in such a way in which they fall into this deep gray area. And we know from big accounting firms that sometimes they'll sell these tax schemes to clients knowing they've got a 25% chance of passing a court test. So basically a lot of this activity is in a legal gray area until it's tested by court. But yes, ultimately the consequences, they're the same. We're talking huge losses of tax revenue around the world every year.
And when you get someone like, say, Tony Blair, who, politically, whether you like him, whether you loathe him, he stood for some things that were quite good, it seemed, and now he's campaigning for world peace. And then he's involved in what for him is probably a relatively small sum, £300,000 he saved on a housing deal because the company that owned the house was offshore, and so basically bought the company and did it that way. That's a fantasy amount of money for a normal person, isn't it? So it all adds to the immorality of what's going on, doesn't it? This sense that, these are small piddling amounts of money. They don't matter to us, but we're going to actually exploit it anyway.
Well, what the Pandora Papers confirms is that our global tax system has basically been operating as an ATM or cash machine for the rich and powerful. Now, be they drug traffickers, pop idols, or the very politicians we trusted with our taxes. And yes, those sums add up. Every second, the world loses the equivalent of one nurse's yearly salary to a tax haven. Every second. Over the course of the full year, that will sum up to $427 billion, stripped away from governments around the world and basically handed over to the rich and powerful via these tax havens. That's $427 billion that could have gone to our schools, our public health services, the environment, our roads. It's a global problem that affects each and every one of us.
You said a nurse's salary every second. I mean, that is absolutely shocking, isn't it? The whole thing, the whole concept is so shocking. The Panama Papers back in 2016 lifted the lid on this kind of chicanery, didn't it? It's now 2021, and I'm asking, has anything changed? It seems it hasn't. Is it because the authorities are scared of some of these characters involved? I'm thinking of the likes of Vladimir Putin, for instance, who has a very long reach.
So there was a huge public outcry after the Panama Papers, and what that resulted in was in a huge step towards transparency. But what we got were half measures on transparency from governments around the world. And what the Pandora Papers reveals now, 5 years later, is half measures on transparency don't work. We need full transparency. Otherwise, there's always going to be a sliver of shadows for those bent on abusing tax to hide behind.
I need to add here that the Kremlin denies that Vladimir Putin has bought an apartment for someone who may or may not have been his mistress and their child, his child perhaps, allegedly, in Monaco here in France. Lastly, what can the UN do, for instance, or can anybody actually do anything against this?
So what we need to do is reprogram our global tax system. But the problem is those who write the rules are the ones doing most of the tax abuse. For the past 60 years, a small club of rich countries at the OECD, that includes the US and the UK, have been writing international tax rules, but our research shows that over 2/3 of global tax abuse are enabled by OECD countries. So those writing the rules are doing most of the tax abuse, and that's a huge hypocrisy. So we need to move rulemaking out of the hands of a club of rich countries at the OECD and to the UN. Now, there has been a huge momentum growing towards that. Just this year, the UN Faculty Panel, along with active and former heads of states from around the world, presented a proposal for a UN tax convention, and they propose a new body at the UN to monitor taxing rights. The will is there, we have a roadmap, and hopefully the Pandora Papers will be the push to get us there.
From the Tax Justice Network, Mark Bou Mansour, Communications Coordinator. Thank you, sir, very much indeed for giving us some enlightenment on this story. You pay your taxes, I pay my taxes. Most of us do pay our taxes, and we're playing fair. It's the others who've got most money who aren't, it seems.